Joining us today is Scott Lukas, Professor of American Studies at the University College Dublin's Clinton Institute. Welcome to our program, Professor Lukas.
Oh, thank you for having me here.
Ukrainian long-range drones have hit another Russia's oil refinery in the city of Ufa, more than 800 miles away from the front lines. Twice this month, second attack happened just this morning. Meanwhile, in Crimea, Russia's largest oil depot was hit by another Ukrainian drone attack, and this depot is still burning right now. From your perspective, do you think there is any regret in the Kremlin or from Vladimir Putin himself over invading Ukraine and facing such consequences?
Oh, you should have a different guest. You should be speaking to Mr. Putin about that. But if I was to take a guess, I would say that Vladimir Putin does not express regret to anyone. And indeed, he does not express defeat to anyone. So the Kremlin's line on this, if they bother to speak out on this, will be that, of course, we are we are withstanding all the Ukraine drone attacks. Look how many drones we have shot down. And there is no way that they can stop our special operation, as they call it. So rather than trying to guess about Mr. Putin's state of mind today, even while Russia, I think, is struggling, I think it's better to assess, all right, where are we now? Close to 45 months after the full-scale invasion. And I think it's interesting you start with this question because, we could have started with the battlefront in eastern and southern Ukraine. And, we have heard for a long time, Russia is winning, Russia is advancing. They have so many troops, they have so much artillery, they have so many drones. And they're making almost no progress on those lines. Meanwhile, what you have on this day-to-day basis is this different type of campaign, which is the Ukraine drone campaign. And now we are also seeing some Ukraine domestic missiles. And maybe we will see other missiles, including U.S. Tomahawks. But even just the drones, I'm waking up every morning and I have a new operation to report on. And so you've just mentioned in Ufa, where they have struck again far behind the front lines. But of course, the largest oil depot in Crimea, now burning for a third day. That's huge because, Crimea is that reserve position close to the front lines in southern Ukraine, and then from the south to the east. And if you restrict the oil supplies that the military can count on in Crimea, it limits their ability to move and maneuver. I will emphasize again, this does not mean Russia is being defeated. We're not talking about this, Ukraine strikes being the decisive factor in the war. This is a war on multiple fronts. But I think it does indicate that on these multiple fronts, you have Ukraine facing challenges in terms of resources, in terms of personnel, but you have Russia, despite all of its numerical advantages, facing great challenges, not just on the battlefront, but in terms of its own economy and where it goes over the next few months if it cannot get a breakthrough.
And also, interesting story for Kyiv Independent. A resident of Russia's Belgorod region has complained that life in Russia is simply hopeless due to Ukrainian strikes, blackouts. According to the call intercepted by Ukrainian military intelligence and posted on social media on October 13th, would Kremlin be able to explain their people why they should suffer from this for a long haul?
Yeah, I'm always careful with respect to military intelligence, to their claims about intercepted phone calls. I mean, it is in Ukraine's interest to present, Russia's population being willing to put their hands up and say, this is it. I do think we have to be realistic here. From Russian sources, we know that people in the west of Russia, especially after Ukraine was able to overrun part of the Kursk region last year, we know that civilians were frustrated there. We know that they felt they were not getting support from their government while they faced hardship. We know that in Belgorod, which has faced a series of attacks and which has faced a series of outages to power and to utilities from those attacks, there is frustration there. But it's one thing for people to be frustrated, and it's another for them to say, we want to stop. I think just to state a basic, people in Ukraine civilians have had to put up with far more than what people in Belgorod have had to put up with over the past 45 months. And people in Ukraine have not given up on this. I think that you have to realize that the Russian people will have been told by the Kremlin day in, day out, this is an existential battle. We have to defeat Ukraine. They are this threat to us. They who have been told by the Kremlin, you have to make sacrifices for the sake of Russia, for the sake of, indeed, for the sake of your military. And it takes a lot. It takes a lot for people to turn against that official propaganda and say, no, we think you're lying to us. We don't understand why you're using us to suffer for the sake of your egos and your attempt to conquer your neighbor.
I'd also like to cover long-term consequences of these strikes, because there were another suggests that next year Russia could become up to 60% dependent on fuel imports due to the recent intensified drone attacks. What is your assessment of these long-term consequences?
I think this issue of fuel supplies is one of the key issues in the long term for both countries. You will know that Ukraine has its own challenges this month because of the escalated Russian attacks. So Ukraine has to, as apart from being able to export, as they were to, electricity at some points, they now have to talk about importing. Indeed, the idea that 60% of gas supply was interrupted or affected recently. But you take that in Russia as well, that these strikes that we're talking about, which are not just on oil refineries, they're also on gas pipelines, they're also on the transport system, that this has turned Russia from being an exporter of energy products, which is how they finance this war, to turn around and say, well, no, we actually are going to have to import energy supplies, which they are doing now from Belarus and from China as well. Now, that has a couple of effects. One is that it has the energy effect of that if you cannot import enough of those supplies, you are going to get rationing. You are seeing rationing of gasoline in certain parts of Russia, especially in the Far East and in Crimea, and occupied Crimea. And you're seeing cut off of electricity in certain areas as well. But there's also an economic effect here. And that is quite obviously, if you cannot export as much of your energy products and you have to import more, you have to spend more. And Russia, which is already almost stagnant in terms of its economic growth, the International Monetary Fund has just revised the growth figures downward yet again for the Russians. Russia has this slowing growth and has the prospect of, how do you fund this government budget, which is so devoted to the invasion, if you cannot continue to get the revenues, the energy revenues that have been one of the key parts of not just this invasion, but indeed of Putin's economic tactics for years.
Let's cover also a really interesting report by Financial Times. I'm sure you have already read this information. The US has been helping Ukraine to mount the strikes on Russia's oil refineries for months in joint effort to weaken Russia's economy. Also, Financial Times sources said US intelligence helps Ukraine shape road planning, altitude, timing and mission decisions, enabling Ukrainian drones to evade and to avoid Russia's air defense assets on the roads to Russia's oil refineries. How can you assess this U-turn in Trump's policy and another approach, also taking into account the summit in Alaska?
I'm very glad you asked this, because I think this is one of the most important stories of this year. If we were to go back to the start of this year, we were talking about not just that the United States was stopping the military assistance to Ukraine in terms of equipment, in terms of air defenses. They had stopped the intelligence sharing. They were openly saying, that's it, and we were asking, well, can Kyiv rely on the Europeans for this type of information? Where are the gaps going to be? Well, you forward about 8 months later, and here we are talking about that some of the success of these Ukrainian operations deep inside Russia is because of the Americans. The Americans have, the best intelligence capabilities. We know this in terms of tracking and monitoring sites that could be struck from the air. And now, we don't know. Haven't been told the full extent of that cooperation, but I suspect it's extensive. And it's interesting, the officials who have revealed this, sort of leaked it to the media, the timing of this. And they said this happened after a conversation near the end of July between Vladimir Zelensky and Donald Trump. And I think that's significant because I think it is part of this ongoing story that if President Zelensky and the Europeans can get to Trump, if they can play upon his ego, if they can flatter him, you are the great peacemaker, you are the great supporter of freedom. If you can get him to do that, then you can translate that into meaningful action by talking to American officials. Trump doesn't know that much about what goes on in Ukraine and Russia. Let's be very honest here. What he knows, however, is like the sound bites. And what you have where Zelensky and the Europeans go to him in July and say, look, Russia is not necessarily going to win this conflict. Russia is vulnerable. You don't want to be on the losing side here. You want to help us out. Now, here we are 2.5 months after that restoration of intelligence sharing in October, as we talk about whether the U.S. might provide Tomahawks. And Trump is now saying openly, Russia is actually in danger of losing this invasion. Remember, he used to say they were going to win it. He used to say that now it's not even there's a stalemate. He says they may lose this because of their economy. Well, how does he know that? Because officials are telling him that. So it means not only have President Zelensky, the government, and the Europeans been able to work on Trump, they've established that relationship with U.S. officials who are telling Trump, who are presenting the state of affairs to him. And I just think you have to keep that effort going as we await the next visit of Vladimir Zelensky to Washington, which will be on Friday.
I just want to continue this topic of the Americans' stance on Ukraine and the visit of Zelensky. And of course, Trump is considering sending Tomahawks for Ukraine and calling it as a new step of aggression in the country, in the country's war with Russia. And but at the same time, media and experts everywhere in Ukraine and in the West argue that such a move would not change the course of the war. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, we have to be realistic and say there's no decision yet on the Tomahawks because the Trump administration is divided. And if you wish, I can go into the different factions, some who are favoring sending Tomahawks, some who are opposed. But if you look at the actual capabilities of the Tomahawks, you say, well, what can they do? Okay, they're a sea-launched missile. They can't be launched from the air. So that doesn't mean, that does mean you have to rely on that platform to send them in. But you have a missile which has a precision strike range, not just an overall range, but a precision strike range of up to 1,600 kilometers. Well, 1,600 kilometers is pretty far behind the front lines, to say the least, going inside Russia. And we know that the Tomahawk, which has been used for more than 20 years, you can remember it from the 2003 Iraq War, is one of the most effective missiles in terms of hitting targets, in terms of accuracy, and in terms of the amount of damage that it does. So I have no doubt that if the Tomahawks are added to Ukraine's arsenal, that it is important. But it's important by not just looking at it in terms of just the Tomahawks. I mean, the Tomahawks alone don't decide this conflict. The Tomahawks are used as part of a basket, as you will, of munitions. So now Ukraine has drones. Ukraine has domestically made missiles, and we're waiting to see the effect of those. But if you talk about the Flamingos, for example, Ukraine has some sabotage operations. Don't forget that as well. But now Ukraine has the Tomahawks. And so the Russians now have to face multiple challenges. We already know that Russia's air defenses are overstretched. We know they're overstretched because they can't protect those oil refineries and those gas pipelines. Well, when you have overstretched air defenses and you add another set of munitions they can strike, it increases the strain on the Russians as well. It also would be a huge symbolic blow. Do not underestimate this. Many people, you've heard of Tomahawks in Ukraine. I've heard of Tomahawks in Ireland. Many people have heard of Tomahawks when they would not have heard of other systems. So to see the Trump administration give this to Ukraine or sell this to Ukraine to be used, it would be like, wait, he is on their side. Trump is not simply in Vladimir Putin's pocket. And for morale, that's a huge bonus as well, especially as we get into the winter months, when it's going to be more and more difficult to make a breakthrough on any front in the military campaign.
So you think it's now hard to say whether Zelensky will actually leave the White House with Tomahawk missiles. So there is still not yet any decisions, even that we will have this planned meeting in 2 days.
Let me go a bit wider on this because I think it's important to realize there are multiple issues in play here and to realize while Zelensky's not going until Friday, there have been some pretty important Ukrainians who've been in Washington since the start of this week, including the prime minister, including the head of the Security Council, Mr. Umerov, including Zelensky's chief of staff, Mr. Yermak. So they're talking about multiple issues. I suspect they're talking, I know they're talking about air defenses. They are also talking about economic and financial support to Ukraine. They're talking about the possibility of toughened sanctions on Russia. So there's a basket of things we watch for. That's why I'm being a bit cautious, because even if Zelensky doesn't come back with the Tomahawks or a commitment on the Tomahawks, if he gets commitments on other issues, that's important as well. I wouldn't want to predict at this point with Trump because we've said this before. Trump is chaotic. He is unpredictable. He is temperamental. He will just have been coming off of a very busy week for him where he has portrayed that he's the peacemaker in Gaza. Hooray for me. There was a very big domestic ceremony yesterday for the slain Trump activist Charlie Kirk. Do we get happy Trump or do we get grumpy Trump? I think if we get happy Trump, and especially if you have him being primed by people like Keith Kellogg, by the real working level people in the intelligence services and the military who can tell him what can be done, I think we'll have Trump at least talking about the potential for the Tomahawks being sent sooner rather than later.
And I also have a question from the practical point of view of launching these Tomahawk missiles. If we imagine that Ukraine will follow a good and positive scenario, of course, for us, and finally get this Tomahawk, we probably still need to have a ground-based launcher capable of carrying out these missiles. And just recently, U.S. defense company Oshkosh Defense unveiled a new mobile ground-based launcher. So what does this tell us? And is there any realistic chance that Ukraine will get this launcher?
What it tells us is you put your finger on the important point, because I referred to it earlier as the Tomahawk being a sea-based launcher. Now, that's traditionally how it has been launched. But Ukraine doesn't have an extensive Navy to provide the launch platform for the Tomahawk missiles. So you have to look at being creative with the ground-based launchers. Now, as we mentioned, if you can launch them, they have a very long range. So I suspect that was a leak to the media that was timed to say, look, the Tomahawks might be on their way. Look, there is a way to launch them. In other words, this wasn't just simply a piece of news out there for us to grab. So the idea is the platforms are potentially available. The Tomahawks could be available. What is going to be important is that when Zelensky's in Washington on Friday, the militaries will also be talking to each other, the Ukrainian and American militaries. What are the details about putting this all together? Where are the launchers coming from? Where are they going to be based? How are they going to be protected? And What is the targeting that is going to be provided for the Tomahawks? All of that is in play here. And that is something, again, we have to be realistic. Even if you get the best news at the end of this week that the Tomahawks will be provided, it will take some time to bed that in. So this is not going to be Tomahawks supplied this week, and by next week, they're already making a difference. All of these details have to be worked out.
And Professor Lukas, don't you think that this is a bigger game is played out right here, a game of narratives, a psychological war battle between Trump's administration and Russian dictator Putin? Don't you think this Tomahawk topic is being used as a bargaining chip to force Vladimir Putin to get back to negotiating table rather than a clear military option?
Yeah, but Vladimir Putin's not going to get back to the negotiating table. I mean, that's what the Trump folks say. Oh, we want to get him back to the negotiating table. Look, you've observed him for years in Ukraine. For Vladimir Putin to go back to the negotiating table, he would have to have in front of him a guarantee that he gets certain things. And what is it that he would have to get a guarantee for? The rest of Donetsk in eastern Ukraine. I get to have that even though I don't hold it right now. He would have to get a guarantee of the lifting of sanctions on Moscow. He probably would have to get a guarantee of immunity from any type of legal process regarding war crimes. He would have to get a guarantee that Ukraine would not only be allowed into NATO, but that Ukraine would not have a close relationship with NATO. And he might actually ask that there be barriers to it joining the European Union. So Putin doesn't come to the negotiating table to negotiate. He comes to have his demands accepted. So then you have to ask the question, well, if he's not going to come to the negotiating table, what does this mean? And what it means is that as the invasion continues to be resisted, now the Americans are supporting Ukraine. Now they're locked in. Now it may be that they're supporting not by providing the military equipment, the weapons, the missiles, that they're being sold to the Europeans to then give to Ukraine, but the Americans are bedded in. And that's the big change from the start of this year. Because if you think about it, the Americans had been bedded into supporting Ukraine since February 2022. Not with enough, we know, and often too slow, but they were bedded in. You had all these institutional links. All these links were being broken at the start of this year. Now they're being rebuilt. So it will be much more difficult for the Trump administration to walk away from Kyiv. It's going to be tougher for Putin to say, we're winning, you need to support us. And that in its own way is a victory, because I will now be honest with you. I don't know if I said it openly because you don't want to say it. I was very worried probably back after that White House meeting at the end of February, which is that the Americans were lost. They were gone. That not just Trump, but the threat of J.D. Vance, the threat of others like Steve Witkoff, his envoy, it was so great that somehow it was going to be Europe standing with Kyiv and others in the world community, but we could not deal with them. The Americans were just AWOL, to use that phrase. Well, the Americans are back. And if you want to know how I know the Americans are back, go ask the Kremlin this week. Go ask the Kremlin when Dmitry Peskov was sitting there thumping his chest, right, this week, going, this is all just for show, the Tomahawks, they won't make a difference, don't worry about that. Ask the members of the Duma who are saying, look, we have all our weapons here. They shouldn't mess with us. Look how tough we are. Ask former President Medvedev in one of his social media rants. They're worried. They are worried about what the Tomahawks mean, not just for the immediate effect of the Tomahawks, but what it means in that wider political diplomatic game, which if they haven't lost it, they certainly have lost their advantage that they had only 7-8 months ago.
Also, according to Politico, Trump feels emboldened after so-called his personal success on the Middle East and is really looking forward to reach a deal on Ukraine. He's still confident that he can make this deal to end the war in Ukraine. How does Trump's so-called success on the Middle East, this breakthrough, could influence the war in Ukraine and negotiations between Americans and Russians?
Trump will want this even more, because Trump, he stood up, sorry, forgive me for smiling, but he stood up on Monday in Israel's parliament, the Knesset, and said, I'm the guy who stopped 8 wars in 8 months. I was like, well, no, you didn't. And to be honest with you, and for another conversation, he didn't stop the conflict in Gaza. What we did get was a ceasefire, but there's a lot that remains to be established there. But precisely because Gaza is not done, and indeed, unfortunately, I'm not sure the ceasefire will hold. He's going to want this even more to say, oh, I've got a success over here now. Now, again, as we talked about earlier, Putin is not going to give him that success. He's not going to sit around and hand it to him and say, I'm coming to the negotiating table. I'm going to sign a so-called peace deal. So if you're Vladimir Zelensky, if you're the Europeans, if you're the rest of the international community, and you know that, what do you have to do with Trump's ego? And we all know it's about Trump's ego. Let's say the quiet part out loud. You have to say, President Trump, you have done so much for peace. You have done so much. It is so unfortunate that President Putin, that he will not listen to you. He should listen to you. We are listening to you. We appreciate what you have done. So we need you to understand how much we appreciate you continuing to support our defense. Oh, and by the way, if you keep supporting us in our defense, you will win. And how will he win? He will win because Russia will lose. Here's the thing about Donald Trump. And I've watched him for decades. I remember when he was a businessman in New York. I remember when he was the TV star on The Apprentice. He only wants to be with a winner. He does not want to be associated with a loser. Once he thinks that someone is a loser, he runs away. So you have to get to him that Vladimir Putin is a loser. He's a loser in what he tried to do. He's a failure in what he has not accomplished. And Mr. Trump, President Trump, do you want to be with the winners who are going to hail you as the peacemaker who helped save Ukraine? You know, and who knows? People may even give him the Nobel Peace Prize next year, even if he's an authoritarian at home, but someone who in his own way finally supported Ukraine abroad.
Thank you, Professor Lukas, for your time and insightful answers, and glory to Ukraine.
Slava Ukraini. Thank you both. It's been a pleasure.